let's make this clear. The purpose, the first logic, right? There's layers of logic here with the Europeans, right? The Europeans are in full warmonger mode, right? They're Keir Starmer and Macron, and I assume that Merz will join them as soon as he is officiated as the new Chancellor of Germany. They want to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, right? They believe ultimately. First of all, they believe that if they make the threat to put troops down in Ukraine, that Russia will never agree to a ceasefire, right?
Yes, which is the point I was getting at.
That's part of the logic. Right. And they're right. Russia, as long as they're talking about that, and Trump has not made a statement saying, no, you won't, right, and ordering them or something like that, right? Russia's never going to agree to a ceasefire. So their first thing is to blow up any type of top of a ceasefire, or if they're intending that, even at the end of a peace process, that's an automatic red line, right? In losing the war in Ukraine, you don't get to claim victory with NATO troops on the ground, right? That's not the way that this is going to happen, right? And okay, so their logic is, I think they're essentially. Have you ever seen a pack of hyenas goading each other on to take on a lion? Right? How they'll dart forward and yap and snarl. And I say this, hyenas, forgive me, because I have far more. Hyenas are fascinating, incredible creatures at a moral level so far above the Europeans that, as far as I'm concerned, that I'm pained to make the comparison between.
You're disrespecting hyenas.
I'm disrespecting hyenas here, but forgive me, hyenas. But that's what it's like. It's like the hyenas actually had a lion on their side, but he's like, I'm not feeling it today, right? I mean, he's wandering off. Now they're trying to goad each other on, right? I believe that they are trying to push, certainly Macron and Starmer, even if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire, right? Even if there is no pause in the fighting, they're working up to sending European troops, British, French, and whoever else, Baltics, I don't know, into Ukraine, right? Not on the contact line, right? They know that, right? They want to hide some troops in Lvov. They specifically mentioned Odessa, possibly Kiev. They're calling it a reassurance force, although they also said a robust reassurance force. And I'm like, that word robust, you don't even have a robust forces in your capability, in your arsenal left, right? You keep using that word robust. I don't think it means what you think it means, right? But they want them there as a human tripwire force, right? Thinking that Russia won't dare attack them, right? Because they're still NATO troops, whatever hat they're wearing. And then if Russia attacks them, then no matter what Trump says now, he will be forced to come in, and then we got World War III, right? And they're absolutely ready for that. That's their chain of logic. First of all, ruin ceasefire and negotiations. Second of all, get troops on the ground, which is the equivalent of a dog, urinating on something to claim it as its territory, right? You won't dare, try to claim this back for me if I drop my, urine on this territory, right? Whatever they have, left in Ukraine, and they're of course severely mistaken, because that is not the mood. I mean, Putin just showed up to the front in Kursk for the first time in this conflict in camouflage, right? That was a message, right, to the Russian people, to the West, right, to the Kiev regime, that, whatever, phone call fantasies, that Trump is playing right now, that Russia is laser focused still on the conflict, because
to be fair,
serious peace negotiations haven't even begun.
Well, right? To be fair, Trump had sidelined Europe in these conversations on the war,
and they're going to inject themselves back in, And if they put troops on the ground, that's it. I mean,
Yeah.
there's zero chance of any negotiations further. Right? I mean, that's it.
Yeah.
That's done. That's war then. And Medvedev, wow, the language. I mean, I like to call the new Medvedev, right? Like there was the Medvedev in the 90s who was dancing around to the song American Boy.
Oh, he's a hard ass now.
Right? I mean, he wasn't even a closet neoliberal. He was a neoliberal in the 90s. He was a pro-Western neoliberal. Now he's Zhirinovsky 2.0. He's the most fire-breathing, whatever. I don't know whether it's genuine, whether this is the rebranding, or whether he really had some type of Damascene conversion along the way. I can't say. But anyway, so first of all, he replied to Starmer's threats over the weekend, right? At two different posts on social media. And the first one, he said that Starmer can shove those ideas, the ideas about troops on the ground, back up your shithole, like shithole, right? I'm sorry, for the YouTube censors out there. But he did qualify that with comma, diplomatically speaking.
Fair enough. I don't know if there's a difference, but fair enough.
Right, yeah. Right. So, and then the second post, I mean, that came out over the weekend, he said, frank out, if any NATO members put troops on the ground in Ukraine, right, under flag, under uniform, we all know they're there in small numbers anyway, but that will be war. And he said that right out. It will be war, right? Because it needs to be said like that, right? I think Putin actually needs to say it to bring it home still, because,
he is far too diplomatic. Even in his, look, I think his response to Trump was masterful. I agree with you that this is his way of saying, okay.
Good cop, bad cop.
Yes, absolutely. Because if you remember, in response to Kursk, Medvedev says something like they will be mercilessly and methodically hunted down and slaughtered, or something like destroyed. I think he used the term.
And that's exactly what's happening as we speak.
Yep. I think he is Putin's it. I think that's what he's really thinking.
Are you familiar with Key and Peele, the comedic duo in the comedy? Right?
Remember this? I made the exact same analogy.
Anger management translator, right? Exactly like that. Medvedev is Putin's anger management translator. Yes.
Yep. I made the same analogy to Garland. I was like, that it's Medvedev tells you exactly what he's thinking. It's just brutal.
I actually told that to Garland too. So we've been.
I'm fascinated by that. Because look, Putin is very diplomatic, and I guess my thing is, in a conversation with Donald Trump, let me ask you this: what does Putin offer anything to end the war, or is it just, look, we won. This is what we need to end it. Full stop.
I can't. All right. So if you go back to 2021, right? What Russia was demanding from security guarantees. I mean, I say demanding, but they were basically begging the West, please sit down and let's work this out so we don't have to do this, right? Before the Russian intervention began and Biden blew them off, right? But they were also demanding that NATO withdraw forces from Eastern Europe, right? From the Baltics, from these other countries, that from basically anything further east than Germany, right? The U.S. military bases in Poland and Romania, right? These air defense missiles, which are also, being Aegis ashore systems, are also, of course, capable of firing nuclear tipped tomahawks and the like, right? Which was, part of the real reason there. So those were all, things that Russia was demanding at the time. I think that is Russia's idea of a concession at this point. All right, we'll drop the demand for that, right? I mean, that's they're not making out. According to the New York Times, they made in fact, they actually used a picture of Yalta to talk about this. Buying into the Trump and Putin are dividing up the world, in a phone call meme that's going around, which I for one do not believe. But hey, I mean, we'll all find out. But they specifically mentioned Odessa, and so I mean, most Russians believe that Odessa should end up in Russian hands at the end of this conflict. It's a Russian city. There's majority Russian-speaking, Russian-leaning people in Odessa. It was founded by Catherine the Great, and it need to cut the Kiev regime off from the Black Sea, right? Of course, the West thinks exactly the opposite. They desperately want to maintain a Ukrainian port. The British keep talking about putting naval bases there so that they can have naval bases on the Black Sea, which, of course, is just waving a red flag in front of the Russian bull in this regard. But the New York Times, for some reason, mentioned that Odessa was being discussed, and I've heard other reports talking about that, which I regard to be complete nonsense, that Russia is considering trading the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in return for control of port infrastructure in Odessa, which just seems absolutely ludicrous and impossible and completely non-workable to me. But anyway, the problem with Odessa, of course, is the geography, because an amphibious assault to take Odessa is just not within Russian capabilities, not without taking World War II level casualties, which Russia has, and even then with no guarantee of success. And even if they were to do it with contested river crossings, they'd first have to take Kherson City and then Nikolaev and only then Odessa, right? It's very hard, right? It's very hard. And even in World War II, when the Soviet Union took Odessa back from the then Nazi Germany instead of Nazi Kiev, they had to go up through Kiev and down to the south then first, right? So the geography of Odessa is very hard. So however much important a strategic objective it might be for Russia, it's going to be hard. And the absolute best chance, is probably as part of some final settlement, but not that is not going to be achieved right now with Russian forces still fighting in Donbass, still fighting, still fighting in Donbass and Kherson City and Zaporozhye, right? I mean, Russia's going to have to be moving on the Dnieper and moving on Kiev, which is a possibility because Russian forces have driven the Kiev regime forces out of Kursk region, right? Again, there's like one or two hamlets that they're still, fighting over right now right on the border. But Russian forces are also already in Sumy region on the other side in Ukraine, right? And if Russia has very significant forces now in the Kursk region, right? They built up very significant forces. And to be frank, they built up enough forces that even if their special forces operation with this pipeline assault didn't work, I mean, it had phenomenal success. I don't think that they expected it to have as much success as it did, where the Ukrainian forces just broke and ran, and then Russia just picked them off as they were leaving, right, to huge losses. They had enough forces built up there to take it if that didn't work in a concentrated assault. So now they can move into Sumy region, possibly even taking Sumy City. And if they take Sumy City, then highway straight to Kiev, right? And that's where Russia, in the beginning of the conflict, how they came in. They came in through the Kursk region, through Sumy, and then to Kiev in the very beginning of the conflict. Right. Yeah. Later they withdrew as part of this nonsense Istanbul communique that they were hoodwinked on once again. But they can repeat that process. And that is the most likely scenario for Russia getting Odessa back. A move in force on Kiev that forces an unconditional surrender, right? And then demanding Odessa as part of a settlement. Right, as part of an unconditional surrender, but we're a long way from that. We're a long way from that, right? And the Europeans, again, they think they're going to put troops on the ground in Odessa. They're going to do anything they can to save it, and they're talking now that they'll swing in immediately after a ceasefire agreement, right? Practically guaranteeing that there will be no ceasefire agreement. But I believe that they're working themselves up to doing it, even if Russia doesn't agree.
I think they're trying. I mean, I think the catch becomes whether or not the U.S. allows it.
I don't know. I think the Europeans at this point are as that they will just do. They are working themselves up to doing it. Right? They keep saying we need a U.S. backstop, and the Trump people keep saying no. But I think they're working themselves up to doing it, even if Trump, refuses.
We'll see.
They're that panicked and desperate, and panicked and desperate people do stupid things, right? Yeah. Stupid things, right? So they're just in a mental propaganda space, ideological space, where they can just not like the Kiev regime, like Zelensky, whose own people says he's delusional and you can't talk reality to him, right? I mean, his own people talking to Time magazine again. I think the European leaders are by and large, Fitzo and Orban accepted from that, of course, are in the same type of mental space, right? Where Blinken and Sullivan in the auto pen would be there if they were still in office in the U.S. as well, right?
I accept that. If Trump wants a deal, he's going to have to tell them no. And if they have the stones to blow off the U.S.'s no and decide to put troops in, okay, those people are going to die. I don't see.
Trump actually already suggested that Europeans, I mean, that was actually in a policy brief by Hegseth that the U.S. expected the Europeans to put troops on the ground as part of any settlement.
Would Russia accept let's say China, India, etc., as a peacekeeping force?
I think these are fantasy suggestions. Why on earth would China or India want to send? First of all, even the creation and the mandate, that would take months and months and months for something like that to be worked out. I can't see the West accepting that much. I mean, Russia couldn't really politically object to it, but I think the Chinese and the Indians and the Russians
would be like, why are we doing this?
The only troops that are going to be allowed on the ground in Ukraine are Russian troops. That's it. The only security guarantee that will mean anything that a future government in Ukraine, right, if a Ukraine exists at the end of this, will ever get is a security guarantee by coming to an accommodation with Russia. That's it. That's all they're ever going to get, right? I mean, Starmer can make all the promises of 100-year security guarantee from the UK he wants. He himself has said, we need a security guarantee from the US in order to properly give our security guarantee to Ukraine, right? I mean, it shows what a fantasy all of this scenario is. It all comes down at the end is, do you want World War III?
It's going to be that, right? Which
I believe that Ukraine is important enough to Russia and Russians and the people of East Ukraine, right, that they will go to that brink and step over it on the issue of Ukraine.
Does the West want to do that? Political implosion in Ukraine, like meaning after Kursk, for example, that is going to shock the conscience. This is a Zelensky UK project that failed radically, that got nearly 100,000 people killed, with all sorts of equipment and everything else burning in Kursk as we speak. Does this create a political, I don't know, nightmare?
There is no politics in Ukraine. There is no politics. There is a dictatorship, right? There really is.
The reporting, I agree with you. But the reporting is saying that Trump is trying to find his man for Ukraine.
He was until Zelensky rolled over last week, right? And now that talk.
He didn't roll over. He's gone rogue. Zelensky repudiating everything Trump has been saying.
Yeah, unfortunately, how do you do that? How do you do that, right? Zelensky refuses any elections, right? He's already gone to the brink. The U.S. already tried the withdrawing at least rhetorically, withdrawing military and intelligence support. Whether it was real or not is another question. And the suggestion being put out that Zelensky should resign. And the Europeans all stepped up. No, 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 we love you. We'll protect you. Did daddy say mean things to you? And that was gone, right? The pressure was alleviated, right? And eventually it was, yes, okay, so they agreed to say, oh, they'll mouth the words, yes, we want a ceasefire, right? But knowing full well that the Europeans were doing everything possible, with their threats to make sure that no ceasefire was ever agreed to. But Zelensky he's gone after any political opponents he could potentially have. I mean, he's resuscitated the treason charges against Poroshenko. He's been going after Timoshenko, which the U.S. seems oddly like trying to resuscitate this old gas princess hag, right? Evidently she finagled an invitation to Trump's inauguration somehow. But I mean, first of all, she wouldn't be acceptable to Russia. So Zelensky completely wrote himself out of any possibility. Not only one is he a committed Banderite fascist who would be even less amenable to any type of negotiated settlement than Zelensky. I mean, remember, this is the man who had 2 busts of Stepan Bandera and one of Shukovich in his office with the big red and black flag when he was the head of the Ukrainians military. Because one bust of a genocidal Nazi collaborator wasn't enough. You have to have 2 of them, right? And he himself, last week, he spoke at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the UK, and he said that the Trump administration was destroying the world order, right? So obviously Trump is not going to want to make that guy, and he would be, at least there are polls that, again, take any poll in Ukraine with a big healthy grain of salt as far as I'm concerned, but showing that he was more popular, at least in a head-to-head matchup with Zelensky against Zelensky. So, but I mean, he's wrote himself out of possibility. The British may want to put him in. He would suit them just fine. But I don't think the British are going to get to decide who the next ruler of their regime in Ukraine is. And if Zelensky doesn't agree to elections and he controls the security services and the military now, Syrskyi is pretty loyal to Zelensky, throughout this whole conflict, and the same thing with Budanov and the head of the SBU, right? And then who forces him to step down?
Yeah,
right. No, I mean, and under what justification do you? I mean, crazy things happen in this world. Al Qaeda takes over Syria, and the EU just accepts the former head of ISIS and Al Qaeda and proclaims him a humanitarian exemplar of democracy and freedom and liberty. So, I mean, crazy things do happen, but Russia would object to most of these things anyway. As far as Russia is concerned, Zelensky is useful. Right? Because he's so incompetent. He's so bad at forcing the military to do things for political reasons rather than out of strategic decisions. He's terrible at diplomacy. He grates on just about everyone. Right? I think that's why they haven't taken him out, because anyone they might replace him with might be more useful.
Competent.
But I have to be honest. Peace is not in Russia's interests, right? Because there is only one thing that can save this Banderite fascist regime in Kiev right now, and that is Donald Trump. And any peace deal that Donald Trump pushes through will ultimately save a U.S. proxy Banderite fascist regime in Kiev, which is why I am fundamentally opposed to any peace deal that doesn't see this regime ripped out, root and branch, from Kiev and the entirety of Ukraine. And I just can't conceive of any way that is possible without a Russian occupation of Kiev. Can't imagine. I've thought about it, right? How could you lustrate all of these Banderites out of the Ukrainian political sphere, the security services, the military, these US aid NGOs, which, even the Europeans are trying to keep them alive, right? The entire Ukrainians body politic and body social is infected with this cancer. How do you remove it? There is no peace deal to be struck that keeps this regime in Kiev. Maybe they'll change Zelensky out for another figurehead at some point, like Poroshenko was traded out under a sham election for Zelensky. That does not remove the regime, right? They will still have Azov being brought into schools to teach kids.
I'm glad you mentioned this. Boris Johnson, in an honest moment, because they're so few and far between that you get an honest moment with Boris Johnson. Listen to what he says, and I want to get your commentary on this, because you're right.
Yeah, I saw this video already.
Yeah, so Zelensky gets elected on a peace ticket. Boris Johnson is talking about Zelensky dealing with immense agreements and why he couldn't implement the agreements, the international agreements, by the way, that they just entirely blew off.
You got to remember that Volodymyr Zelensky is not he's not an unreasonable guy. He got elected really as a peacenik. He was out that in 2019 he tried to do a deal with Putin. As far as I can remember, his basic problem was that the Ukrainian.
He can't say the word nationalist.
The compromise and you can see why not. I mean, you got to remember that
he can't say it. He can't say it.
He couldn't say neo-Nazis, right? He couldn't say Nazis. He couldn't say Banderites, right? That's not in their lexicon. So nationalists, right? I mean, look at reaching for that word there. Oh, it was so it's too funny. Yeah, and he's right? Yeah. So I remember the video, right? Zelensky was elected primarily by East Ukraine, right? As the not Poroshenko who could come to some kind of accommodation with Russia. He was a Russian-speaking ethnic Jew from Kryvyi Rog, from East Ukraine, right? He had made, he had starred, right, in the country in a TV series which used to be available on Netflix, Servant of the People, right? Which his political party that he created was then named after, as a school teacher who accidentally became the president of Ukraine and worked out compromises, right, with Russia, with the West and everything like that. So people had hope, right? He had done comedy skits mocking the Banderites, right, as part of his comedy troupe, and also playing the piano with his sexual member and all the transvestite, all the other crazy things that he was up to. You can find a video of Zelensky doing a comedy skit on just about anything, right? That will, I mean, it's like finding a Bible quote, right? There's a Bible quote for everything, right? It's like there's a comedy skit that Zelensky did, that points out the irony of everything that has happened since. But he was elected on this. People of East Ukraine thought that he would bring peace, but he found out when he came into office that the regime that he had become the president of was built on the Banderite fascists. So, the ones who provided the muscle and the ideological force on the Maidan, that took over the government buildings, right, in Kiev, and cemented their control and forced Yanukovych to flee the city. All right, that formed the battalions that then tried to attack the Donbass and extend the control there when the Ukrainian military refused. Right, and only later would it be purged and brought under control and so on. Right. This is at its heart. It was actually called in a more honest time, there was an article that admitted that Azov was a neo-Nazi state within a state. And Azov is just one part of a, hundreds of these Banderite battalions and groups and everything. And do you know what publication said that?
Probably New York Times.
Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
Did they?
Yes,
Are you serious?
Check it. Just do a RFERL Azov neo-Nazi state within a state, and it will pop up on Google. Yeah. That was in
They admitted that.
Wow. Something like that. Yeah. It was crazy. Completely, more honest time. So Zelensky actually tried to go to the front line in Donbass and order an Azov commander to pull artillery pieces back beyond the firing range that was mandated, right? That they've been moved out of firing range as part of one of the initial steps of the Minsk process, the Minsk protocols. And the Azov commander refused, right? And there's video of this, right? And Zelensky was arguing, in Russian, of course, ironically, with this Azov commander. And I'm not some loser off the street. I'm the president of Ukraine, right?
Yeah,
and the commander's like, I don't care who you are. I'm not. And after that, all peace efforts just slowly melted away. And Zelensky turned into, just the figurehead. He internalized all of it, right? Eventually. He has, by all accounts, he fully has, I don't know, we want to consider it Stockholm syndrome or what, but he has come to fully embrace everything in just out of hatred of Russia over this whole affair. And that's what this regime is built on. And until this regime is removed, that Russia's security dilemma and peace in Ukraine will never be achieved. I mean, any reformed government of this regime, even under a peace settlement, right? For all the Russian-speaking, Russian-leaning people of Ukraine outside whatever territory that, Russia manages to get out of a supposed peace deal, do you think they're going to let the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, just start practicing normally again because it's not 100% politically loyal to the regime? Do you think they're going to let pro-Russian politicians in East Ukraine, run for office? Why? I mean, that has been the antithesis of everything they've done since 2014. So until you get rid of this regime, there can never be free and fair elections in Ukraine. There can never be normal politics. There can never be normal life for anyone who doesn't agree, or at least keep quiet and their head down around these Banderite fascists who, ultimately are the vanguard and glue, that keeps this regime in power in Kiev.
And there's a bullet for anybody that is going to sign their name on the dotted line saying, "We surrender."
Speaking of bullets, did you see the execution, the street execution over the weekend? Yeah, there is. In Odessa, there's a prominent neo-Nazi, Ukrainian neo-Nazi, whom himself, he worked as a thug for the TCC, for the Ukrainian mobilization press gangs. And he also was one of the organizers of the Odessa massacre. And he was killed. He was gunned down in the street.
There's nothing else to say, right? Somebody popped him.
He was. So it's interesting who gunned him down. He was gunned down by a senior lieutenant from the Ukrainian military who had been injured in the line of combat 30 times. 30 times. So a patriot, right? A defender of Ukraine. So this guy's adult son, because he's an older guy, right, had been working as a fitness instructor in Odessa. And the Kiev regime's press gangs with this neo-Nazi, right, had come in. Well, first, originally, the press gangs came in because they hunt the fitness centers, like the restaurants, like the nightclubs, whatever, looking for people to press gangs, to grab off the streets and throw into the trenches as meat. And a fitness instructor from there, I think it was also some type of manager there as well, basically told them to get out of there. And he told them in very blunt terms. Well, they came back later with this guy and his thugs, this neo-Nazi, and they abducted him and they took him out to the woods and they beat him and they raped him and they made him take a tape of video where he said that he's sorry, he apologizes for everything. These are the real patriots of the country. He also said, I've just taken it up the butt by two guys and I loved it. They made him say that. And that he would be going to the conscription offices in the morning and signing up, right? Obviously not willing. He was all black and blue and bloody, and everything in his underwear while taping this. So he was sent to the front and he died 30 days later. And so this guy's father came back to get revenge on the guy who tortured him, this young guy, his son, and sent him to his death.
Mark,
this regime. This is why. These are the people that are this regime. And until this regime is removed completely, any peace deal that Trump might theoretically force on Russia is only going to keep this regime alive. And so I will consider to be an evil. Well, the only good thing that Trump can do, as far as I'm concerned, is walk away and blame it all on Biden and Europe and whatever. Anything else he does is going to keep this regime in power in Kiev, and that it's going to erupt back in the conflict again, whether in 30 days, whether in a few months, a few years, whatever. The war will be back on, and maybe the West will be better prepared. Maybe the Europeans will actually spend some of that money building up their militaries over the next few years, which is why Russia has to see this through to the very bitter end now while they can. Whatever nice things Trump may be trying to say about Putin or whatever, they can't let this regime stand.
Now, right? You know Putin. You've watched him for years. What do you think he's going to do?
I think he's going to cut. I'm afraid he's going to cut a deal. I don't believe it. Right? Every Russian official, right? Lavrov, Ushakov, Polyansk, everyone you hear, Ryabkov, right? They all say, no ceasefire, no anything. These are our demands and everything. But Putin has caved and agreed to the Minsk protocols 1 and 2, to the Istanbul communique, to all of these other things, and he's been led down the garden path. Putin is not the way they present him in the press, right? No. He's pragmatic and he can be cold-blooded, but he always is perhaps too cautious and he's aware of what Russia's limitations are, perhaps not properly taking into account limitations that the West might have. He's too cautious sometimes. And he always reaches, I believe instinctively, at least up until now, for a diplomatic outcome. Now, he's not done that on a handful of occasions, right? Crimea, in 2014 is one example of that. Right. So, but again, then there was 2 rounds of Minsk and the Istanbul communique. And so, he'll have Trump, this is an opportunity to make good relations with the U.S., blah, 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 blah. We could, fight to the bitter end to the Polish border, and then we have to occupy all of Ukraine, which would be a nightmare in and of itself. And we have to rebuild the country then. And there's a whole lot of argument, and then we'll still have hostile relations with Europe, and in 4 years Trump will be gone anyway, right? there's no guarantee that the next president won't be another Biden. In fact,
Exactly.
Unless it's J.D. Vance, very likely it would be. So you will have all of this, arguing, because the Kremlin does actually make consensus decisions, right? I mean, in many ways, the Russian Security Council functions like a modern day Politburo, right? On questions like this, right? And increasingly about some domestic matters too. But Putin's voice is still first among non-equals, right, at this table. He's not a dictator, but he does. But I imagine that practically the vast majority of the other people in that room will be telling him, no, 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 see this through to the end now, right? But
he may have a different take.
I don't believe he will. And if he did, right, I would, of course, immediately criticize this and say it's a terrible mistake. So I don't believe he will. Logic and everything tells me he won't. But yeah, I can't get rid of that nagging fear in the back of my head that it won't be a Minsk 3.0, right? I mean, and no matter how many times they say no Minsk 3.0, I still fear it. But I mean, there is no good outcome to this. Not for Russia, not for the US, not for Ukraine. There is no good outcome, because even a Russian total victory, right, still then creates and leaves so many problems in Ukraine, in relations with the West, who rebuilds the country, the cost of it, guerrilla wars, right? All of this, so many problems, right? There's no good outcome. There are only less bad outcomes for all sides of this. And that's simply reality. I mean, if you don't want the black pill, then go listen to some of these other people that have been saying that Russia's going to completely win, every 2 months for the last 3 years, and it's all going to be over, and then Trump and Putin are going to sing Kumbaya together and divvy up the world and all of this nonsense. I'm sorry. I'm too much of a cynic to believe that any of that. I mean, you never, in a situation like this, get everything you want. I mean, the U.S. overthrew Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and did they get everything they want? An empowered Iran, with influence through Iraq and throughout the region, things never end up perfectly. Russia won the war in Syria, and then they lost the peace. Or the frozen conflict, if you will, thanks to the treachery of Erdogan. So things never end up, beautifully or well. I mean, Mearsheimer called it will be an ugly victory for Russia, and I think that's still the most realistic, most accurate description of what the outcome will be.
Yeah. I've actually, for a few years now, what does this look like in the end? Because I couldn't see it.
It's messy. It looks messy on any way, right? If it doesn't end in World War III, it looks messy. Yeah. Right? If it ends in World War III, then, we don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, we won't be here. Mark, thank you for this. I always appreciate your breakdowns.
Sorry.
Look, you're absolutely right. I guess in my mind, I didn't think they wanted to take all of Ukraine, because I didn't think they want to be stuck.
They don't want to take all of Ukraine.
Yeah. And so then it becomes, okay, well, what's the deal?
Then there'll be your NATO troops in it.
Well, see, that's the rub. If you don't, right, exactly. If you don't do it, okay, well, then you're stuck with this Banderites government in place.
Stoltenberg said it outright, right, at one point. No more gray spaces, no more neutral countries, right? That's not allowed anymore, right? In the Cold War, there was Finland and Austria and everything. And then up until 2014, Ukraine had neutrality written into their constitution until the Maidan. But that's not acceptable to the West, or wasn't. What in the Trump era, obviously Europe doesn't agree, and whether the Trump phenomenon will last past 4 years is severely in question. But they don't accept a neutral buffer zone anymore, right? Anything, the logic is, if you ever played the old board game of Risk, if you don't take that spot on the map, then your opponent will take it and use it against you, and use its resources and its people against you. And however bad it is for Russia, and it's bad to have to take all of Ukraine, if they don't take it, then the whatever is left will be turned into a ideological Banderite state where every child is trained from birth to hate Russians, right? And they'll be pumped full of arms and everything to be a NATO beachhead against Russia. Or right there. That's why this regime can't stand. And I did not believe in Russia moving into West Ukraine at the start of this conflict. But everything the West has done since, and how Kiev has responded, has convinced me that however terrible that is, the only alternative now is even worse.
Mark Sleboda, he's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, where can people find you?
You can find me on Elon Musk's Twitter X at Mark Sleboda1, or on Substack or Telegram at The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda.
Thank you, my man. Always appreciate you. The audience loves you. And yeah, we want the black pill. We want to be told what's real. And you're one of those people who does it. Mark, thank you for this, man. Be safe.
You as well.
Have a good one. Love talking about